Alright everyone, it's time to talk about the post-truth era. Now you've probably heard this term used. Generally though, when you hear this term, it's being used by like the lamestream media to describe anyone outside of the established mainstream. Essentially the idea being anything that's alternative, a possible new way of doing things politically or socially, a new way of thinking, or just news that they don't want people to actually talk about, which is sometimes, of course, and this is true when they say it, it is spun, it's full of bias, but then again, so is theirs. They just don't want you to notice that fact. Basically, that's what they apply the label post-truth era to. The idea that because of people like me, people have access to news and to opinions about that news and everything else under the sun, that is not going through the normal corporate constraints. It's not getting chopped apart and reconglomerated into a specifically spun, biased form by a corporate conglomerate or by its parent company or by some seven-figure-a-year pundit. It's getting reported on, and any bias it's involved with it at all is coming from some little person. They really hate that fact because they can do it more efficiently. So they want to make the money off the clickbait. So if I make YouTube videos with out there sounding titles and dramatic music and lots of jump cuts, they'll call that post-truth era stuff. And they'll say, well, it's clickbaiting, it's sensationalism. Yes, it is, of course, and there's plenty of that on YouTube, including among some people that I have good relationships with. As far as, I can talk to them, they can talk to me, would have a chuckle about the legacy media, but ultimately there's a lot of sensationalism on their channels. But here's the thing, you get the same bullshit on CNN or MSNBC now. Every time somebody has a slow speed chase, they cut right to it. Here's our live shot of this person going 10 miles an hour. Little old granny, she went to the dispensary, she got a little too high, and now she's fleeing from the cops. And that's supposed, and it's basically like, oh, here we're going to have 10 different people on to discuss how this could go wrong, how little Jimmy can get crushed by her car, or how she could start shooting at the police helicopter. Well, this certainly indeed is a dangerous job. Little old Granny could have a slingshot, and she could start taking shots at the police that are following her. That's basically what you've gotten since the 1980s on cable news. Post-truth era, though, goes beyond that. Post-truth era doesn't just go to the legacy media blaming others for the same kind of sensationalism that they tried to do and failed at because the internet started existing and little people started doing it 1,000 times better and flooding the world with analysis and commentary of every kind and brand that has nothing to do with some parent company situated in Cyprus or Abu Dhabi. It goes beyond that. It goes to people at some point, in many cases, if they're a partisan, and not everyone is, it's actually declining total, which is refreshing, or an ideologue. It gets to the point where they don't want to be challenged in their worldview, even if they have been taken in by propaganda. And here's an important thing to note. It isn't just necessarily the legacy media's propaganda. In some cases, they may be part of some cult of personality style following behind somebody, to the point where they think they can never do any wrong. I've seen this myself among certain people's fan bases. I like to think, hopefully, I encourage people who are watching my material to question the things that I talk about. Like, if you think that I'm wrong in my assumptions about something, yeah, you point that out and it's fine. By the way, unlike in some channels, you don't get banned for that on mine. And people do, and that's healthy and that's good. It's good to have an internal debate there. The problem with echo chambers, and it's being fed by the legacy media, the problem with echo chambers is that you can be totally wrong and you'll always think you're totally right because you're not even allowing yourself to be challenged. I see this all the time. You look, it's worse perhaps with the technological paradigm shift we're in now. Before, a person with an echo chamber, they just tune into one cable news program, but now they can also interact with the content, and that means that there can actually be a bandwagon style enforcement of the norms within that echo chamber as well. I've seen this. You go to any, ostensibly left-wing page, other than Salon, whose own audience is heavy Bernie, and they made the mistake of being pro-Clintonian, and so they kind of alienated their own fans, and now they get trolled by their own liberals. That was funny. But if you go to Being Liberal, for instance, and you make a comment on their story basically, fuck you, you're wrong, you will be called a Russian bot. That will almost certainly be the first comment that's left. Some of the people that do this are shills. They get paid to do this. Others are trolling because they're just trying to start drama. A lot of the people, though, are regular average Joes that are simply propagandized into an echo chamber. And it would be remiss to say that this is even necessarily more common on the left. It happens in the right all the time, although there's one big differentiation. Because the left has not successfully undergone its political transformation, you still have a very large core echo chamber that is more or less homogenized. That is, it's capable of regulating itself. It's unstable. It's going to crack. It's going to schism and fall apart. And the longer they wait to undergo their reforming process, the more likely it is to implode in their faces and totally fuck the Democratic Party and all of its offshoots for some time. So it's not healthy, it's not good, but ultimately it's homogenized. On the right wing, you get a little bit less of it because there are multiple smaller groups that have already undergone that schismatic tendency. You've even seen sub-schisms already in the last few years. The main schism was, here's the Republican core, and the libertarian element of it is kind of tugging away. It successfully schismed. You saw what happened in the last election with the Libertarian Party's voting total. It was up by, 5 or 6 times. Significant incline. That's a lot of Republicans who were like Ron Paulites, but before they were like, oh, we got to stop Obama, so we got to vote for Romney. This time around, they were like, fuck it, we're not going to bother. They didn't like Trump. It was also comprised of some expat Democrats from the Clinton campaign that wanted to punish her. So it was basically the Libertarians, as the only viable third party, were the stand-in for, not Hillary as well. More so than the Green Party, which also, I think got 10 times its prior vote share, which isn't saying much, but it's a start. It's something. It's some voters. Jill Stein was happy about the number of people who wanted to see President Hippie Grandma. You then have the populist element, which is semi-separated from the rhinos. It's like an evolution of the Republican Party. You have a fully schismatic, at this point, alt-right, which in turn schismed the new right, which sort of leans back towards that populism in a weird sort of a love triangle with libertarianism, because its primary mode, its primary aspect is anti-censorship as opposed to ethno-nationalism or even civic nationalism. It's civically nationalist insofar as it supports American values without necessarily even using that term. And then you've got all sorts of you got the alt-light, which is sort of a vacuous term, and all these other things. So that's why each of these individual echo chambers, while they may be more voracious in some aspects, they're smaller and less capable of regulating themselves, so you have more and more strange schismatic movements within these groups. That, although it is chaotic, although it's unstable, it's actually far better than what the left is undergoing. The left is undergoing a situation where you have all these tendencies, but they're still within the same sort of sphere. With the exception of a small number of Bernie Sanders, like democratic socialists that are, they're further out there than the progressives. I guess they would be a fully schismatic tendency at this point. A lot of them, in the next election, will probably end up voting Republican. It'll be very funny to see, or the vote Libertarian, the next candidate will get above 10%. It'll be Austin Peterson probably, or McAfee, or someone who's, arguably better at strategy than the last candidate that they had. Maybe they'll do better. I don't think it'll be an afterthought. Some people are expecting them to slip back into irrelevance. I would hazard a guess. I don't think that that's true. Not with the amount of political chaos we're undergoing right now. It'll probably be a bigger vote share. It's possible that they become technically a mainstream party. Although it'll be like UKIP. It'll be a party that cracks 10-20% everywhere in the country, but has no representation. Maybe they have one mayor and a couple of dog catchers, so they can control the canine population. It'll be really funny, because then they'll complain and harangue, and they'll technically be right, but it'll be like really funny. We're in the post-truth era because a lot of people don't want to hear the truth. Now, they'll immediately take up a line on some event, and even if they are then proven to be wrong thereafter, objectively so, they will keep on with their strange mentality. For instance, a lot of people on the left still think Trump is going to be impeached because he's controlled by the Russians. That concept has been so fully and totally discredited at this point that no sane individual thinks that. It's a combination of people who are on the left optimistically hoping they're going to get rid of someone who they hate, number one, or people who have become delusional. They have willingly decided not to bother seeing the truth. There are plenty of people like when CNN was reporting on WikiLeaks, and they said, don't read the WikiLeaks stuff, it's illegal. We'll report on what's in them, we'll tell you what you need to know. It was a lie. But there were certain people that believed it and probably still believe it to this day and will never read a WikiLeaks report because they're so fucking brainwashed. There are people on the right who have done the same thing. There are still people, I hear like latent Bushites who still think that there were WMDs in Iraq and they believe Bush's bullshit about, oh yeah, Saddam shipped them all to Assad and that's what Assad's using today. Well, let alone the fact that a lot of those chemical precursors would no longer be good anymore since the 2003 era. Let alone the fact that Saddam and Assad weren't really bosom buddies anyway. It's just not true. It would have been impossible for him to move that material without being noticed anyway. What little material was found alive in a well in Iraq in far lower amounts than George W. ever said. There are people, though, that still believe that great lie. And they still believe the Clintons, Bushes, and McCains who'd sold us that false war. And they always will. There are still people who believe all sorts of weird shit about 9/11. Now, not saying, of course, 9/11 wasn't misused to conduct mass surveillance, start several wars, and destroy the American way of life. But the nanothermite stuff and this other tower was deliberately collapsed in a malevolent fashion stuff, it's simply not true. It's been discredited. Let alone, reports about steel beams and jet fuel. Okay, have that debate all you want, but there are side conspiracies that some people believe that simply aren't true. On the day of, there were people that were trying to say that the Hoover Dam had gotten hit by a plane. So it's easy for things to become problematic when they become emotionally or politically charged, especially. We see that all the time, the much Trump stuff. Trump has become, for the left, a stand-in for every sexist, supposedly, that they don't like, every so-called racist, every so-called bigot, everyone that they don't like, they sort of project their worst qualities on Trump, and it's a weird sort of psychological masturbation at this point. That's essentially what it boils down to. But it's not true. It's not reality, not in any objective framework. It's just their perception of reality. That only matters within their perception. Within the reality that they artificially concoct, they're absolutely right. Looking in from the outside, we see someone who's basically a fucking lunatic, but to them it's totally real. Unfortunately, while the internet gives good ideas, the ability to eventually, this is my opinion, rise to the top in an evolutionary fashion, assuming a free market of ideas that is not meddled in by governments and big tech too much. If the meddling is kept at a minimum, my idea is that good ideas, good political movements, good social beliefs, good individuals tend to become more dominant over time. It's a thinning out process. It's evolution, whereas people who don't have talent, they fall flat. Unless CNN gives them $1 million and gives them an ad campaign, tells you they're the next big thing. And they do this to people online. They try to make false personas. They do this with music constantly. Some boy band that ultimately it's just, vacuous bullshit that's been ripped off from some band from the 70s. They'll take it, they rehash it, they give them a 10 million marketing campaign, all of a sudden they spawn a platinum album. And then they get addicted to coke and they get washed up, and then eventually Time magazine has a write-up about where are they now. It's very funny because it's sort of recycling the same bullshit over and over. It's like a human centipede. But online, there is also the unfortunate counterbalance, which is that in the short term, those that are essentially, they're totally wrong. Political hackery is rife, and it only gets slowly thinned out over time, and there are always new political hacks that rise up. It's a never-ending struggle. It's a never-ending sort of weird purification of information. The post-truth era, though, is when people form echo chambers that become more or less impermeable. And so that is what, over time, they break up. It's just a matter of when they do. In the meantime, some people's minds are basically shackled. They'll put the shackles on themselves. They'll actually lay in their own fetters willingly and voluntarily, and then they wonder why the world is a shitty place. And it's just really, really funny. That's about all. Peace out.